800,000 federal workers would be temporarily furloughed. Thousands of government employees deemed essential have to continue to show up for work, but for nothing more than an IOU. The nation's 1.3 million active duty military personnel would remain on duty. However, they would not be paid until Congress passes a continuing budget resolution. NASA, the EPA, and the Department of Commerce would essentially stop functioning, with the vast majority of their employees forced to stay home. The impacts could be even more devastating for the Americans on the receiving end of government services. Nutrition assistance for women, infants, and children would stop. Government-backed loans to small businesses would be suspended, and expiring Head Start grants would not be renewed. But many fear that these consequences, awful though they are actually not the worst that could happen. That's because they would pale in comparison to the even larger risk posed by breaching the debt ceiling in several weeks. According to the New York Times, Wall Street has yet to panic about a shutdown, mainly because they're waiting to see whether or not the nation defaults on its credit on October 17th. As Ezra Klein writes, a shutdown, after all, is just bad for the economy. A default is catastrophic for it. And joining the panel now is MSNBC.com national reporter Erin Carmon, as well as joining us from Washington is MSNBC policy analyst, the Washington Post aforementioned Ezra Klein. So Ezra, you, I think, have been a little bit more optimistic than many, just in the sense that you seem to believe that should we have a shutdown, this will teach the Republican base, the House caucus, a lesson that they will not want to repeat when it comes to the debt ceiling. Do you still believe that today?
I think people are getting this slightly wrong. I start from so much deeper a hole of pessimism than almost anybody else. My writing appears optimistic, judged against normal baselines. I believe, and a lot of people don't believe this, that defaulting on the debt is a real possibility. I don't think it's a 0% chance possibility or a 5% chance. I think it's 10, 15, 20. I think it could really happen. And if it really happens, I think the consequences of it are unimaginably bad. I mean, they could, if it went on for any length of time, you're dealing with a financial crisis that could be on the order or even above what we saw in 2008. So the argument for a shutdown, which again, in any normal world, we should not be having, we should not be talking about, is not a good thing. But the argument for a shutdown is that if we can play out this high stakes drama in a visible way, where there's a public backlash that scares Republicans and also brings in Wall Street, brings in business, convinces people that something is really going on in Washington, and they need to put pressure to make it stop going wrong before we breach a debt ceiling, I think that lowers the risk that we breach a debt ceiling. So I don't think a shutdown would be a great thing, and I'm not sure it will stop us from doing something worse later. What I do think is that if Republicans decide, as John Boehner is telling them to decide, to not fight on the shutdown in order to fight on the debt ceiling, that increases the likelihood of a debt ceiling breach, and that is a worse outcome.
And that's even worse. And Erin, of the list of things that I mentioned, you know, cutting aid to women, infants, and children, cutting Head Start, the only thing on that list that struck me as being potentially able to change the minds of the base of the Republican Party about what they're doing is the cuts to military pay. Is there any chance that seeing that happen, that actually seeing cuts to members of the active duty military, them not getting their paychecks, could that actually convince the House caucus to change its mind?
Well, of course, there have been drafts in which they're exempting military pay. I mean, at this point, I think, you know, they're just going to write their fantasy list, and that's what we're going to end up with. And I can imagine a scenario in which military pay would end up not in that. I just keep thinking about Ted Cruz talking about his concern for single mothers. And when you talk about WIC funding, it is such a phony ersatz concern expressed by him. And I'm curious, sort of, for Ezra, you know, you make it sound like there's a sort of rationality, as if we could sort of have a little bit of bloodletting and then, you know, then save the patient. If they get it out of their system the first time around, then they won't take us all the way to the brink on the debt ceiling. I mean, do you think that they're going to sort of have their fill? They're going to feel a backlash. This time will be the time that they'll see reason?
I think there's a chance. I mean, I think it's worth remembering, right? They didn't shut the government down in 2011, though they thought about doing it. They didn't breach a debt ceiling in 2011, though they thought about doing it. They didn't breach a debt ceiling in early 2013, though they thought about doing it. These are not folks who are just like complete lunatics, or at least not all of them. And one thing that's been true here, and it's an important thing to remember, is that right now, at this very second, there are the votes in the House and in the Senate to keep the government open and to raise the debt ceiling. Mm-hmm. Because if Boehner would open it up to Democratic votes, they would all vote for it. Right. So you have a situation where where what is going on right now is that the political pressure is not sufficient enough to make the most vocal members of the Tea Party stand down. They haven't felt like they've had their fight yet. But in general, when they feel like they've had their fight, they do eventually back down, and we've seen that on the fiscal cliff and other things. I don't believe in the model of the Republican Party where Republicans don't fold, where they're somehow immune to political pressure. I think that they are overly reckless, and they are under-convinced about what the government actually does and what it would mean to either shut it down or to breach the debt ceiling. But ultimately, they do respond to public pressure, and one thing that I think is making this particular series dangerous is the public has kind of become used to it. They've begun to say, oh yeah, they're just fighting. At the end of the day, they'll figure it out. And when there's not that public pressure, I worry that at the end of the day, they will not figure it out.
And Josh, I think that's what I worry about too, that this is becoming a pattern, that essentially what Republicans are learning is that this is the new normal. This is the way to do business in Washington.
Right, but the pattern seems to end with them not defaulting on the debt when we've been through this before. I don't think the House Republicans are crazy either. I think they're people who respond to incentives, and they're trying to do two things.
But Josh, this is not a way to run a stable first world democracy. We cannot careen, do you think, from crisis to crisis with Republicans saying, well, because at the end of the day we don't actually blow up the government, we can carry the bomb right in there and hold the detonator switch. We really are never going to press the button.
Well, it's not a good way to run a first world government, but I mean, the Italians have been doing sort of similar things for like the last 60 years. In fact, the government in Italy is just over the weekend, it looks like it's going to fall again. And so Italy is, in a lot of economic trouble, but it's a first world country that is wonderful in many ways. So if we're becoming like the Italians, that, it's not
in the worst
Josh,
way.
It's not the biggest crisis.
Everyone who's watching now with Alex, if we're going to become Italy and Berlusconi as our model, we're in deep trouble. Right. I mean, the vacation spots are wonderful, but the government is not something I think. Do we really want that sort of system where it's literally...
Right. And we also have to come to a scenario in which yes, a clean CR can pass the House, but only if Boehner wants to imperil his speakership. I mean, this is what we were talking about in the break. How do we get to that scenario, that Boehner is willing to break the Hastert rule?
In which we are all relieved that there are no bunga parties involved in it. All right, the Washington Post's Ezra Klein, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And after the break,